Welcome back to another episode of the Vision Hunters podcast. I'm your host, Cody Story, and this is episode number 18, Customer and Problem-Centric Selling with Adam Peak. First, before we get into today's show, new episodes of the Vision Hunters podcast have been released on Wednesday on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. However, I do have an announcement to make. Due to my current work schedule, I'll be moving new episodes to be released on Fridays instead of Wednesday. So moving forward from this point on, new episodes of the Vision Hunters podcast will be released every Friday. I repeat, new episodes of the Vision Hunters podcast will be released every Friday. As far as today's episode, I was really stoked to have another guest on the show to discuss some of the technical aspects of one of my favorite sales methods, which is gap selling. And out of all the sales systems or sales training that I've either, dove into, or that I've either read about and researched, or that I've actually, let's say, signed up for some training, well, gap selling and also the Black Swan method feel like the best approaches for me. And that's why I'm so stoked to have Adam on the show to talk everything related to gap selling. So if you're in sales or if you're currently selling a product or a service, I recommend you check out both of those methods because you might find them to be extremely beneficial to you as well. And some of the things we discuss specifically in today's episode are things like how Adam found his passion for selling in an industry dating back as far as the Egyptians and the pyramids, why Adam has found a real love for sales and why he stayed in it for so many years, how you're gonna win if you're not right within, which is a quote from Lauryn Hill, and why that is so important to Adam in terms of establishing a foundation to actually sell from. Like he was talking about how you need to know who you are. That way you can understand what the best sales process is for you and your customers. Why gap selling, why he decided to go from what he was currently doing into this method, why you need to get curious about your customer's current state and what they're aiming to achieve before you ever share your solution, some simple ways to improve your questioning abilities in the discovery. Also, what a command statement is and how it can be extremely beneficial to your discoveries, why you should find the problems before probing deeper into your customers' processes, the importance of role playing, getting your reps in or practicing, and why you should interview your current customers and how that can help you be more specific in your questionings during your discoveries, and how to customize your presentations to your customers' current problems, which once again, you found out if you did an in-depth and specific discovery prior to sharing how you can potentially help them. Now, let's get into episode number 18, Customer and Problem-Centric Selling with Adam Peak. Adam Peak, welcome to the Vision Hunters podcast. It is great to have a gap selling advocate like yourself on the show. So welcome aboard and thanks for taking the time to share it with me and also our listeners today.
Yeah, for sure, Cody. Thanks for having me on. I've been I accidentally gap sold for a while, I think. And then I read, what's funny actually. So Keenan and I've connected up now because I'm going through like trainer certification with him and his team. And I haven't even told him this actually, but like the first time I saw him on LinkedIn, I was like, man, you can miss me with this guy. Like, this is like such a freaking act. Like, this dude's all over the place. I was like so turned off. And then it was so it's funny because then like people kept commenting on this stuff on LinkedIn, and I was like, all right, maybe his content's pretty good. And then someone gave me the book, and I read the book, and I was like, oh yeah, this is it. Like this is the thing. Like we were kind of talking pre-call, like it allowed me to be human in sales. So anyway, man, like I'm sure we'll dig into it, but yeah, it's been a fun journey for me. in the gap selling world, especially in like a non-tech space, because so many people are so hyper focused on like SaaS and tech, and I'm in an old industry,
Mm-hmm.
so in the packaging industry.
Okay. Well, I think you just set a great frame there, and that's exactly why we're here today. I'd love to dig into more of gap selling and your experience with it. And just to maybe give the listeners some context, as you just alluded to, you're in a maybe older industry, but sales is sales, whatever the industry is. And I really aligned with the gap selling principles and the method. And I think it allows that kind of flexibility and versatility if you can just bank on those fundamentals and those principles. So, what was it like for you pre gap selling? Like, how did you get into the sales world and sales? And what were you introduced prior to gap selling? And like, what led you to it? Because you just mentioned like how you saw Keenan and you're like, oh, I don't know about this guy, maybe personality, but then something must have aligned, maybe the stars, I don't know.
Yeah.
But how did you go from where you were to getting involved? And then I'd love to go a lot deeper into the whole process that you're going through right now for certification. So
Yeah, no doubt.
there you go.
So, yeah, so I work in the packaging industry. It's the packaging industry has been around. I mean, like ancient Egyptians. I mean, it's a really, really old industry.
Mm,
And, if you look around wherever you're listening to this, just the device you're listening to this podcast on, the space around you in the pot, in wherever you're listening to this, it all exists because packaging played a role. So like
mm,
your cell phone, like people keep their iPhone packaging, for example. But even all that packaging to make the Apple packaging, like it needed all the raw materials needs packaging, like this whole inceptionary world of packaging that
yeah.
exists. So it's a huge industry. It's a $1 trillion global industry. And I've been in it now for about 15 years. Prior to getting into sales, actually even prior to getting into the packaging industry, I was a pastor. So I was a youth and college pastor in Colorado.
Mm,
Got into the packaging industry through my uncle, who owns a company in San Diego called Peak Packaging, which still exists, like my last name, Peek Packaging. You should go hit them up; they're awesome. So I was working there. Moved to Colorado actually to get out of packaging, stay in pastoral ministry. I started a church with some friends. I thought that's what I was going to do. And, I'd say God had other plans because I got into it and I was like, I really love packaging. Like I get to talk to all sorts of cool
wow.
people.
Yeah.
I'm like speaking at like marijuana events.
Uh-huh.
I'm interacting with like engineers and marketing people and innovations and also like it's such a huge world that I didn't even realize existed until I really got into it. And so I just fell in love with it. I got into sales about 10 years ago in the packaging industry. So that's how I got into selling, and that's really where I found my home
Mm,
within the industry. I had done some supply chain and some purchasing and procurement prior to that, but I really found my home in sales, and so that was a little quick
mhm.
snapshot of my life.
What do you
But
feel drew you into the sales element? Like there was other avenues you could have gone, but like what was it about the sales process or working in that capacity that you're like, you know what? I think this fits.
okay, so what drew me to sales? I wish I had like a really just like motivating,
Hmm.
dope reason for it.
Yeah.
But what drew me to sales was I was pastoring this church and I needed a job that was flexible that could at least make enough money to support my family.
Mm,
And so I got a job with an industrial supply company in Denver
hmm.
selling for them. And I didn't know what I was doing. I just, I got a job and I figured I had to go talk to people. So
Yeah, just go
that's
talk to
what I
people.
did. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't know. That was about the long and short of it.
Uh-huh.
So why did I get into sales is not super exciting. It was very pragmatic. Why I stayed and loved sales though is a lot more motivating because I started to realize that when I really connected, like when I sold something that really helped somebody, like a company solve a problem, especially in packaging, that then impacted their customers, which then impacted their own bottom line, which then allowed them to like pay their bills on time. It allowed them to
Mhm.
to do some other things with their like when I did this job right, there was all these different bottom lines that were impacted, including my own personal checking account, right? So
Yeah.
it was a way to kind of be an entrepreneur, to be the CEO of my life, and for my family, and also make a much larger impact than I even knew I was going to be able to make.
Mm. Okay, so you alluded to a right way in which you can work with people. So that means maybe there is a way in which isn't as right. I don't know if wrong is the word, but what was your, like, I don't know, did you go to sales training with that
Yeah.
company or different companies? And what were you learning in the beginnings? Because gap selling seems to be quite different from a majority of the sales trainings that I've looked into, which is one thing that drew me. But what were you doing before that maybe didn't work as well, or that you just started out with because that's kind of what was shared with you?
So I don't think a lot of people have the fortunate background that I did, which was my dad and I are really close. We're still close to this day. And my dad was in sales for, is still in sales. He's, what is he now? Don't shoot me, Dad.
A
66 years
veteran.
old.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got into it and I called him because he had been selling for a minute, and I was like, "Hey, what what do I do?" And he told me a couple of things that are gap selling principles. I didn't know that it had like this system behind it, right? But he
Mm-hmm.
told me, he said, whatever you do, fall in love with your customers' problems and not with your company's products. And
Mm.
so I didn't spend a lot of time like understanding all the intricacies of what we made.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a lot of time interviewing and talking with people about what their problems were, and I spent a lot of time realizing that my company was not the end all be all, and I needed to know what other companies did so that I could be a trusted referral source for these companies. Because
Mm-hmm.
I really valued the people that I was talking with,
Mm.
but I knew I couldn't just force stuff on them. And maybe in other industries, that's a way to do things. I found that it wasn't super successful with other people that I worked with, at least
Mm-hmm.
within the packaging space. So I think there's kind of there's maybe a methodology that was like, you can convince people to buy stuff from you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was like the closer mentality, like go out, the movies,
Yeah.
what are they? Boiler Room and
Mm-hmm.
Glenn
Wolf of
Gary,
Wall
Glenn
Street.
Ross, like what's up?
Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah, that's the second time I've
Mm-hmm.
actually never seen Wolf of Wall Street yet, but
It's a good
that
damn movie. I'll be honest with you.
all
It's
right,
an
I never
enjoyable movie, but I would just say different tactics or
yeah,
different
yeah, exactly. Um
principles to apply.
Yeah, and so for me also, like, carrying into this my whole self, like, I can't disconnect, like, who I am, like, as like a pastor, right?
Hmm.
So, like, I'm trying to live and treat people the way that I understand Jesus lived and treated people, like, that's how I'm
Hmm.
just trying to live my life, and so I'm carrying that into sales, and so I'm like, it's like, put others' needs before yourselves, and humility, consider other people better than yourself. The golden rule, treat others the way you want to treat, that you want to be treated. The idea of love and like self-giving, sacrificial kinds of love, like that's just what I'm trying to do in general. And so I didn't have training when I first got into sales, so I just leaned on that
Hmm.
and really just figured out like what I had to become like a sales pastor basically. Like, when
Yeah.
people would have issues, it's like when you're doing counseling with somebody through their personal issues, you got to walk through like where are they at right now, and like gap selling terms, like what is your current state,
Hmm.
like your marriage is in shambles, or you're addicted to alcohol and drugs, or like whatever the thing is that, like, you got to really get somebody to be aware of that, and then understand what it is they want to do and what their motivations are to get there. So, like, I guess when you kind of ask the question, it's like, what's the wrong way? I
Hmm.
would say the wrong way is based on immoral principles of how you treat people. And we still see this stuff all the time, but it's like, I'm going to get mine. I got to get paid. The only reason to sell is to kill and go to the
Yeah.
bank. Like, that's it. Like, that kind of idea is
Mm-hmm.
still around, I think.
Yep. Oh,
I
it
think
is.
it's going away, or at least it should be going away.
Mm-hmm.
But even the fact that we call, like, somebody was asking me this the other day, they're like, "Are you more of a hunter?" And I was like, I'm not killing people. It's like, oh, so yours is like, you eat what you kill. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
can we just stop with like all the war and hunting and like
Mm-hmm.
murder references for a second here?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about sales. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that, like, I'm not down with just even the metaphors, much
Mm-hmm.
less the principles that come behind those metaphors, because it's inherently selfish.
Mm. So it sounds like you're coming from a place of who you are, and that is like the foundation in which you stand on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So maybe for somebody new to sales, or maybe somebody in sales that hasn't tapped into that, what are some ways in which you can really maybe get clear on who you are? That way you can be in an alignment in terms of your process or your sales process.
Yeah. So behind me, if you're watching the episode, I don't know, is this on
It'll be
video?
on YouTube, so it'll
All
be a
right, cool.
visual and an audio.
So yeah, so if you're watching it, cool. If you're not, I'll describe it anyway. But there's a picture of Lauren Hill, and a friend of mine actually made this. She lives here in Utah. Her name's Andrea Hardiman,
Mhm.
and she made this not for me. She just made it, and I was like, "That's really cool." And it's one of my favorite Lauren Hill lyrics of all time. And she says, "How you gonna win if you ain't right within?"
Mhm.
And and she repeats that over and over. And so I like, for somebody who's new in sales, like, really understanding your own intrinsic motivations, really wrestling with your the things that are driving you to be in sales. I'm not saying that that selfish people don't make money in sales. Hear me, please. Like,
Mhm.
it's just like, but if you win, my advice is like, but what is next? Like,
Mhm.
because I will tell you this, like, I went from making 30 something thousand dollars a year prior to getting into sales, or
Mhm.
prior to getting into packaging. And my year before I got really heavily into sales, I made 45 grand, and I had 3 kids and a wife.
Mhm.
And so I never would have thought the years that I was making over $300,000, you would have thought like I would have been rich. But what you would realize is I don't want to say it's never enough, because that's really cliche, but
Mhm.
it's less than you think. Um, whatever you're imagining in your head of like that next amount of money that you're going to go out and make, and what your checking account's going to be, what you'll realize is the level of effort to get to that amount of money
Mhm.
oftentimes is not met by the satisfaction of getting there. Um, and so having motivations beyond just, rain making commission checks,
Mhm.
is going to be really critical, I think, to sustaining a longer life in sales. Because then, like, again, we were talking before, like Josh Braun talks about, like, disconnect from the outcome.
Yep.
You can't control that. Your company is going to change your commission structure at some point in time. You're probably going to make less money some years. You're going to make more money the next year. Like, if you're so tied to that emotional roller coaster of that commission check, then you are not going to be long for the game.
Mhm.
So figuring out why you want to be in it and what you want to do, and having something that is internal to you and intrinsic to you, that you can fall back on when your largest customer says, "Hey, we picked another supplier." When somebody doesn't get when you don't get paid and you get a clawback on your commission, right? Like,
Mhm.
there are bad things that happen. Sales is not all great. It's not
Hey,
all
there's a lot that
golfing
comes
and
with it.
expense reports.
Yeah, there's a lot that comes with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you mentioned right at the beginning of the show today, you maybe didn't identify with the personality as far as Keenan and gap
Yeah.
selling. Um, and then you started to somehow see that there was something that you were doing, and it sounds like it was similar to what you were hearing through the gap selling methodology.
Mhm.
So what was that like? How did you go from, hey, you know what, sounds like we're doing things that are pretty similar, and then what got you to like want to dig deeper into that methodology if you were already doing it?
Yeah, so my I was trained through Sandler training, if you're familiar
Okay,
with
a
Sandler
little
training.
bit.
So
Hmm.
that was how like the corporate training was. And it was always kind of like, yeah, okay, that's the thing that our company is paying for us to do. But candidly, very few people actually did anything with it. So you'd kind of grab like little incremental things
Hmm.
here and there because it was pretty complicated. And it wasn't always different industries, I think, are well, they're just different. There's different buying patterns, there's different sales cycles, there's different some industries you're going to have a lot more like highly targeted. You're not making 150 calls every day. You're making 5 calls a week if you're lucky, because you're managing a large book of business and you're more account management, retention, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So for me, I always felt like Sandler was always kind of missing something. I never really knew what it was, but that wasn't my deal. So when I read Gap Selling, what was funny is it was what was, to me, it was what I was missing was the simplicity of the concept. And the reason why I said I was accidentally gap selling for a number of years, and I did tell
Hmm.
this to Keenan, was I had done like back in like middle school and high school, I had done evangelism training. And even when I was like in college, like show up, like talk to somebody in the dorm room about Jesus. Like, you want to
Hmm.
talk about a gnarly cold call? That was pretty crazy.
I
Um,
bet. I bet.
and so we were trained to like build this diagram, which was like or like a line of questioning, which was, well, tell me, where do you think you go when you die? And then people go like, I don't know, I'd probably go to heaven. Okay, why do you think you go there? I'm a pretty good person. You're like, oh, interesting. Can you define good? And then you would go through and like help them define, like, see what is good. And you're like, yeah, but what if good is defined by this? And what you're doing quite literally is creating a gap between what is good or perfect and what is bad. And you would
Hmm.
help people to see that the whole idea of, I don't know if you have a background in like evangelical Christianity, but this idea that like we're all that like people are all sinners and there's a gap. Literally, you would write out a gap on this thing, and you're over here, and this is where you need to be, and the gap is filled, and you would draw a cross. I'm
Mm.
not kidding you. In the gap, right? So
Wow.
like that's where the value lived, was like, and that's where Jesus was, and that's how you'd pass from death to life and all these kinds of things. So
Mm.
my background, I was this was not a new concept to me. I had just never heard it put in business terms with the clarity that Keenan delivered it. So yeah, like the personality thing, at first it was off-putting, not because he's brash. Like there's plenty of like brash people that I'm good friends with. My dad is like Irish Catholic from Philly. Like there's a
Mm.
lot of really loud people in his family. But I just thought it was, I felt the first video I saw was like, this seems like it's kind of some disingenuous BS. And now that I've gotten to know Keenan and like gotten to read the book and like gone, like, no, it's all genuine. And the book is what really drove it home for me. Was like, this is what I was missing. It was consistent with my core principles, and and was simple enough for me to understand. Like I didn't have to be remembering all sorts of different things. It's like, driving home, current state, future state, understanding value. Nobody cares about your products or services. They just care
Mm.
about the outcomes you can provide. All these sorts of things. I was like, yes, finally there's like an acceptable sales training that I can latch onto, that is going to help me in not only in my job, but as I've like passed it out to other people in my industry. I'm like, this is a big problem within our entire industry, not just with me. So
Hmm.
that was why I gravitated towards it.
Yeah, I've had some exposure in the past year, as I mentioned earlier, going through different companies and they have different approaches to sales. And that's what led me, because I was like, this doesn't work for me. As you mentioned earlier, I know who I am as much as I think I should know who I am. Of course, there's always more work to be done. But I couldn't sleep well if I was to lay my head down at night on the pillow with those approaches. They did not work with who I was. So I'm glad you touched on that. And then I started also looking at the sales world at large. And I was like, well, what are the patterns? What is the majority doing and going through? And it set me out on like, I just want to look at who has what as far as methods and approaches. And I started going through and I came across gap selling. And I was like, whoa, when I started reading into it, and then I started seeing his videos on YouTube, and I was just like, that feels like it's a fit. It feels good. Now, how do you do that? Was like the next question. So it sounds like you're also going into the process of getting certified to train other folks in gap selling, which I think is amazing. And talk about having an impact if the industry is pretty much like you said, where it's all about being savage or being killers or just pitching products and pitch and always be closing, yada, 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 which I refer to kind of as like the old school way, even though the principles that I've found in gap selling seem to be pretty fundamental. So they could be looked at as old school. I just think it's a way in which you go about the sales process. So like what let's start defining maybe for folks who don't know what gap selling is about, because you've touched on it with a couple statements. But I'd love to get into like you just described the gap in one way, but in terms of the sales process, if you are, say, providing a solution that maybe is, as you mentioned earlier, SaaS, or maybe it's a packaging thing or whatever the product may be, if you have a product. Now, what is the gap? How do you define the gap?
Yeah. So the whole idea around, gap selling is number one. I will say this. I don't think that this is just kind of my prerequisite here. I don't know that there's any sales system that you would be like, that is a perfect fit for every single industry. And anybody who tells you that, I think or for all of the people in every single industry, right? Like I think that that's crazy talk, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there are systems in place like gap selling that do a really good job at going over many different industries. And because I think gap selling is more predicated on simpler to understand principles. So the whole idea is to engage in a level of curiosity that most salespeople don't get into. So imagine if you're a patient, and Keenan uses this analogy frequently, and you go to the doctor. I'll give a personal example. So I have 5 kids, ages 14 to 6. And during COVID, my middle daughter, who's 10, there it is. Sorry, Shaya. She was not feeling great at all. And of course, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like now she's got COVID, now our whole family and this and that. So we take her to the doctor. Now, can you imagine a situation where the doctor just doesn't ask any questions? We show up and the doctor's like, yeah, she's got COVID and y'all got to quarantine for X amount of days. And even worse, the doctor is somehow compensated on the back end for having more positive COVID tests than other tests, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you find this out, like the doctor is actually incentivized to say it's COVID. Well, if you find out it's not actually COVID, you're pretty pissed and you're changing doctors. Of course, doctors don't do that. That's malpractice, or at least they shouldn't be. If they are, then shame on them. But instead, we went in and the doctor is trying to understand, what is my daughter's current state? Like, what are the actual things that she is suffering from? Okay, so she's got a sore throat. She can't hardly talk. She's got a little bit of a fever. She's got kind of a cough going on. He's like feeling abdomen and all these, like he's doing all the stuff. He's getting all of the current state information. He's charting it down so that then when he does all of his tests to further identify what it is, he can give a proper prescription. Well, it wasn't COVID, because every other disease still exists during this pandemic. It was strep throat. And so he was able to prescribe the right kind of medicine, but I didn't need to be sold on it, because I knew through the process that this doctor was to be trusted and was doing the right things. So in a gap selling world, it's kind of similar. It's not as cut and dry because oftentimes when we're dealing with buyers, they're not going to be as forthcoming because they don't actually know that they're sick sometimes. And they may not be sick, right? And so there can be a combative nature to it. So a good gap seller gets really curious about your buyer, your prospect's current state. You had mentioned like it's kind of a new school thing, and I think it's super old school. There was a belief like with ancient Hebrew rabbis that the smartest, wisest person was the one who asked the best questions, not the one with the right answers. And so gap selling is all about how do you format and formulate questions in such a way to safely and truthfully understand what is actually happening right now. So what is their current state? What are their technical problems? What are their business problems? And what are the quantifiable impacts of all of that? And when you can get to that information together and you're on a journey together with the buyer, you're no longer selling them something. You are literally that doctor, right? Like the doctor is not selling me, at least I hope not selling me, like strep throat prescriptions, right? Like the doctor is a service provider to help keep my family safe and healthy. So entering into that world is critically helpful. And then understanding your own products or services well enough to be able to see, okay, does this quantifiable, these impacts or these values, does our product or service help get rid of the technical problems that are causing all of this stuff? Because you can't solve a business problem and you certainly can't just bring impact unless you're just handing out money. But you can solve technical problems. So, the technical problem of the strep throat, the diagnosis was awesome because it meant that I didn't have to quarantine. And the fact that I didn't have to quarantine meant that I could keep coaching my 14-year-old kid in basketball. And because I got to keep coaching him, because he got to keep playing and he didn't have to quarantine, he had a season high in points and rebounds. So like the doctor can't make my son can't make me watch my son and coach my son to have that. But because he made the right diagnosis, we were able to have that experience. We were able to have that future state, right? And so that's it kind of in general, in a nutshell, what gap selling is. It's understand the current state, see where your buyers are at, understand and be able to quantify the value of the business problems that are at hand and the impact of those problems. And then if you have a large gap and your product is able to shrink that gap, to get rid of that gap, well, then you don't have to close anything. That's when you can go and present what your solutions are, much like the doctor didn't have to close me on the prescription. So hopefully that was helpful and not too rambling.
No, I love it. And I also loved the view or the perspective switch, because I mean, that's one of the things I enjoy the most interviewing people is I want to know how you think about different topics, different subject matter. So I referred to the old school versus the new school, and you went back to folks. When was this?
This was like, I mean, BC, like 100 BC to like 500 AD, that time frame, like ancient kinds of wisdom that we have gotten rid of. Like Western society is like, if you're smart, you know all the answers. And I'm like, no, we can know all the answers now. I got a phone in my pocket. So knowing answers is not really all that helpful. I can tell you when almost anything happened. I can give you it. Like knowing that isn't helpful. It's asking the questions and understanding, how did you get that information? What are the sources that you're looking at? I mean, all this stuff, like really digging in, that's where the value, I think, for wisdom comes from.
Okay, so we're talking about what you mentioned as well. I'll mess the quote up, which was whoever asks the best questions. Okay, because that was something early on with gap selling that drew me in. And then it brought me to another question of like, well, how do I ask better questions? Right? Because there is a discovery process to start the diagnosis process, which is like gathering information, however we would like to describe it. But I started reading his book and trying to learn how to craft better questions, because I was also feeling like some of the approaches I was being taught felt very like interrogator like.
Mhm.
And I didn't like the way that felt. And I could tell it made them uncomfortable and it just felt really dry. And then I'm like, why am I even asking these questions in the first place? So there's a million ways we can go with what you just said here. But let's maybe dive into that, like asking questions. If it's so important, what are some of the ways that we can craft or come up with more precise or actual questions that give us the kind of information so we can come up with a proper diagnosis and really understand if we actually do have what they're looking for as far as the solution? So is there a way, because I also know there's a thing called a pick list, and if you
Mhm.
want to maybe dive into the pick list, and does that help you with question curation and dialing in your discovery process? But like, how do we get better at doing that, which is dating back BC?
Yeah. Um, I mean, so Keenan talks about another book in gap selling by
Deb,
Deb Calvert called Discover Questions.
good
And that's an
stuff.
awesome book. And Deb, she does a really awesome job of walking the reader through different types of questions. And one of them, it's probably the most powerful way to start any discovery call, is to ask a pretty broad, open-ended question that is with what's called a command statement. So something like, you know, hey, help me understand what your current sales process is. And then you shut up and you don't interrupt, you don't say anything, and you're jotting down notes. And from those notes, so kicking it over to a personal example, um, if somebody came over to your house and like if I came over, like I just came off vacation and you were like, "Hey, so how was your vacation?" And I'm like, "I was pretty good. It was pretty good. We had a good time." Like that's like small talk, right? It's like, "Oh,
Mm,
how are you?" "I'm good. I'm good."
mm,
But if you said, "Hey, why don't you tell me a little bit about your time in Puerto Vallarta?" I might start getting out photos. I might be like, "Let me show you when we were snorkeling." Like I might talk for 30 minutes. You would know so much more about my vacation just in how you crafted that question and gave me permission to just talk,
mm, mm,
for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Like, so, I mean, people will just go on and on and on because of how you ask the question. And then what I do is I jot down what are called open-ended answers. And that's where I want to dig in to those things. So, if somebody's going through and they're like, yeah, or, our sales, if we're going back to the sales process, we've got a pretty good sales process. I'll write down pretty good sales process because that's open-ended. How do you define, can you help
mm,
walk me through like, what does pretty good sales process mean? You know what I mean? Like if it's just stuff that's kind of lingered out there, you want to be listening for that intently and then writing it down because that's going to create a flow to your discovery that's based on their answers. It's not your agenda. If you go into it saying like my agenda is that I'm going to get to a meeting where I'm going to pitch, I'm going to get to the demo meeting. If that's your agenda, then you're probably going to miss a whole lot of stuff. But if your agenda is like, I want to figure out if they have a business problem that my company can can help solve, if that's what you're really trying to do, then you're going to have successful calls because the answer is either yes or no.
mhm,
And if you're ahead of your buyer in that a little bit, or I'm sorry, if you're with your buyer in that journey and you're going along with them, then you're going to be at the same pace. The questions are going to start to flow a little bit more naturally. It's going to be hard and kind of clunky at first, I think. But the other thing I think people do is they just overthink it.
mhm.
Honestly, it's like that's another person. Like you talk to people.
Yeah.
Why don't you have a conversation with them? So yeah, so Deb Calvert's book is great. Ask open-ended command statement questions at the beginning. Another one is, if you don't have a problem, like if you haven't identified a business problem, don't start asking really like process oriented questions because that can feel kind of awkward. That's another little tip or trick. But the last thing I would say is practice where failure is totally acceptable. So role play, practice. I don't know if you have kids. Like I practice with my kids sometimes. They don't know it, but
That's great. That's awesome.
like I'll call up my friends. I'll just have a conversation with random people. Like I'll meet someone on the airplane. Uber driver. Like the other day, dude, I was with an Uber driver. This is awesome. I asked him 2 questions. This 82-year-old dude in Las Vegas, 2 questions for 20 minutes. And he gave me so much life information, like so much, just like so many incredible like wisdom and nuggets. 43 years as an oil pipe layer in Alaska. He just went
Wow.
on about his life, and it was super powerful. I had nothing to sell him at all,
Mm.
right? Like I just
Mhm.
want to be curious about that guy's life.
Okay, so you're asking better questions, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned your note-taking process, you a little bit. I'm sure there's more to it, but you
Mhm.
talked about when you find an open-ended answer. And I've actually never heard that before. I've never heard somebody say you're looking for an open-ended answer. Usually people say, well, don't ask open-ended, or what is it?
Closed-ended questions.
Close-ended questions. That's usually what I typically hear. Okay, so those open-ended answers, this is kind of interesting in my mind right now, are the things that guide your discovery process?
Oftentimes, yeah, because people will talk in vague terms,
Mm-hmm.
and if they're bringing it up either on a subconscious or a conscious level, there's a reason that they're talking about it. So very like subjective terms. The whole point of discovery is to discern objective truth. So if somebody says, "Yeah, our goal is to double sales," right? Like, okay, well, you don't know what their current sales are, right? You don't know what time frame they have to double sales. You don't know what their average, is that, are they looking to hire more people? Like, you don't know what their sales cycle is. Like, there's all sorts of things you don't know. But too many salespeople, if let's say you're selling like a sales enablement technology or something like that, too many salespeople would just be like, okay, cool, double sales.
Mm,
And too many sales managers will be like, oh man, you got that nugget, but that isn't worth anything because you don't
mm,
actually know. So that would be an open-ended answer that might be disguised sometimes as like good information. It's somewhat useful, but it's not useful because it's not objectively true. It's just a subjective phrase.
mm-hmm.
So really narrowing in on those answers can then begin to craft and help you understand where the conversation's going.
Okay, so objective truths instead
Yeah.
of
And by the
just,
way, can I just, sorry,
yeah,
I didn't mean to interrupt, but
go for it.
um you can also, at least in gap selling, like asking close-ended questions as validating questions is completely acceptable and actually encouraged, because it shows that you're taking notes. So if somebody says, yeah, we need to double sales. And you're like, oh man, that sounds really challenging. So do you mind me asking, like, what's your current, when was the last time you doubled sales or something like that? Oh, we did it 10 years ago. Okay. Well, what did that look like? What did you do in sales that year? We went from 5 million to 10 million. All right. So where are you at right now? Oh, we did 50 million this year. Okay. And you need to get to 100 million by, they're like 5 years. It's like, okay, now you have a $50 million gap, right? And
Mm,
then at that point in time, you can say, okay, so let me get this right. You need, just make sure I got my notes right. You need to go from 50 million to 100 million dollars in 5 years. Is that correct? They say yes. That's a validating question, right?
mm-hmm.
Um, and that's totally acceptable within the gap selling principle. I don't know about other ones, but
Mm-hmm.
asking close-ended questions it actually shows that you're paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to clarify that because you kind of mentioned it.
Yeah, no, that's great. We're digging into the whole idea of asking better questions, which I think is cool, and getting down to the objective truth. So it sounds like going from general or vague, and that's kind of like maybe an indicator that we should maybe dig in there, and going from general to vague down to specifics.
Yeah,
And then those specifics are the thing that really help us identify the gap when we start to understand where they're wanting to go. And without
correct.
those specifics, how could we define the gap?
Correct.
Okay, cool. You also mentioned role
Look, you
play.
asked
So,
validating questions. Those were all close-ended questions, but they're great, right?
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm. So you mentioned role play. I think some people do it a little bit differently, but I'd love to hear, like, what is your process of role play applying what we're talking about now? What does that maybe look like, or how often or frequent do you do it? I'm a big believer in it because to me, it makes the most sense to do it in that setting. And it gives me the opportunity to help people better when I'm in that setting. And if I wasn't practicing my skill sets, which is to me to be a better communicator, it might be not having the kind of impact I would love to have in my lifetime. So, like, what is your thoughts around role play, or maybe like the structure of it, or what have you found to work the best within role playing?
yeah, I mean, there's various different things, right? So for
Yep.
me, what you're doing right now, as odd as it might sound, is a version of practice. So, like, I have a podcast that I host,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a version of practice. My whole job as the host is to ask questions to a person and hear them talk about their life and their journey in the packaging industry. My goal is not sales per se,
Mm-hmm.
but I have over now 3 years have become a better question asker through practice on a podcast. And of course, not everybody can just start a podcast. Well, you can. Anybody can start a podcast,
You
but
can start one.
yeah. But that might not be as practical, I think, for people.
Yeah.
When it comes to role playing within your industry, I would say find people who are going to be honest with you about
Mm.
that they're going to be like actually role playing, and they're not just trying to be jerks. Because I find that what happens sometimes in role playing is the person, the prospect is going to carry their own kind of head trash and garbage into that, and they're going to treat you like literally the worst prospect ever, and you're not going to learn anything
Mm.
because nobody is the worst prospect ever.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, and if you do meet that person, it's a very quick phone. It should be a very quick phone call.
Mm.
If it's like no, no, yes, listen, I don't have time for this. Can you just send me some stuff, please? Like I'm way overworked, and then I've just said, I really appreciate it. It doesn't sound like we're going to be a great fit for you. And then I just find another person in the company to call, right? Like I don't need to work with that person who's just gonna be a jerk to me and really quick. And I don't know. Maybe there
Mm-hmm.
are ways around that. There's some kind of tactic that I don't know about, but I just don't deal with it, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's only happened like twice or three times in 10 years. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't prepare for that. But
Mm-hmm.
so find somebody within your organization that you can trust, and then interviewing your current customers
Mm. That's big.
is, and if you're just starting off and you're just getting into sales and you're working for a company, just ask to be able to do that. Understand understand your current customers' problems. You talked about the pick chart, like building out, it's called a problem identification chart. So building out what a pick chart looks like for your organization, and don't make that theoretical. Like actually go to your current customers, even tell them what you're doing. Most customers love the fact that you're like, "Hey, I'm in sales. You know that, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, I totally get it." "Hey, so I'm trying to like help other people. Do you mind? You can role play with current customers." I know that might feel kind of weird, but like if you've got really good relationships, there's a lot of really awesome things that you can do
Wow. I never
in order
thought
to
of that one. That
practice.
one's great. Role playing with your current customer. Wow.
Mhm.
No,
Yeah,
keep
because
going. This
they're
is good.
because they're
I'm
they're
loving
not
this.
they're not salespeople, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they haven't been beaten over the head 100 times by crappy phone calls. They hear the crappy phone calls all the time. And so they can help you then understand. Or like for me in a manufacturing environment, I have role played with our procurement people because they like I'll send them like cold emails like, "Hey, how does this sound? I didn't really like that." Okay, and I'll ask them, "Can you send me really good sales emails because I want to get better?" Because the procurement people at your own company, if it's manufacturing, or the people at wherever it is that anybody works, there's somebody there who has to buy stuff, who is getting solicited. They're incredible sources of sales nuggets. They're awesome, and then go talk to those salespeople, right? Like
Mm.
If
Mm-hmm.
somebody has sold the company that you're working for, and your buyer is like, that person was really great, like
Mm-hmm.
this is what they did, why not go talk to that person?
Mm-hmm.
Because now they're invested in your company.
Yeah, no, that's great. So now in the interviewing process, let's say you're like, okay, you got the green light to talk to your customers, right? So what are you trying to dig up? You mentioned the pick list again, and maybe we could wrap this all together, but like, what is the interview uncovering? You mentioned understanding their problems, but I also know a minute ago you talked about technical problems, business problems, and the impact. So this is a long-winded, I guess, pre-frame, but I'd love to get into the idea of interviewing and what you're asking, and then get into maybe defining the types of problems in the pick list a little more. So I don't want to forget those. That's why I'm putting it out there. But let's start with maybe the interviewing of the current customers and uncovering their problems. What is that all about? How do you do it?
Yeah,
Questions you
so
ask?
I mean, I guess it kind of depends. It's so hard to just like carte blanche, because there's not a whole lot of people who are like selling packaging who are listening to this, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be maybe just it's going to be different by industry. So what it looks like for me is, hey Ben, just you've been our customer now for you've been my customer now for 5 years. We've been working together. Yeah, cool. Hey, I'm going to be reaching out to other companies like yours. Number one, you can make my job super easy. Are there like, do you have people that I should just go talk to that you'll just make a referral? Oftentimes they'll say yes. Which this is actually a David Sandler thing, but it's like money grows on trees. They're called referral trees. We just don't ask for them. And you should. So,
Mm-hmm.
you can kind of joke about that and say, so here's what I want to do. If you don't mind, I'm going to practice a cold call with you. Just schedule like 10 minutes on their calendar, and I'm just going to practice a cold outreach with you. I'm going to try my hardest to pretend like I don't know about your product. And then can you just give me some honest feedback about how it went at the end? And if they're a really good customer, they're going to say yes, right? They'll find the time to help you out. And then after that, say, so you get the feedback and you're like, hey, do you mind if maybe I took, 15 minutes and just asked you, not like a cold call, but I just want to know, like, what kind of problems are you facing, not only with our products, like what are headaches that we're giving you, but what are some really common headaches that you're seeing, like if it's packaging, that your other packaging providers are giving you? Like, what's keeping you up at night? What's the one thing, if you could fix it tomorrow, you would fix? Like, I just want to talk to you about some of these questions. And what kind of pressures are you getting from your boss? Like, what are your deliverables? What are your metrics? What are you measured against? What stops you from getting that bonus? What stops you from getting, like, understanding their job, not just the
Mm-hmm.
problems of your product or service, but
Mm-hmm.
what is their actual job? Because oftentimes that is a business problem and an impact that people miss. But we're all motivated by that, right?
Yep.
And if you help somebody get a promotion, you can't give them a promotion, right? But if you can solve a service or a system or like a problem that then solves this other stuff and has this big impact, and they can go to their boss and they can say, look what I did. I delivered that 2%, cost savings that you needed through doing blah 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 blah, and I worked with this vendor. Now you've leveled up with that vendor and with your contact. Now they have a promotion, or they got the raise, or they got whatever it was. So
Mm-hmm.
hopefully that's helpful.
No, that's great. Now, as far as the technical and the business problems, they're different. And then you
Mhm.
have the impact. There's also, as I know, the root cause. Could you maybe give a rough breakdown of how those are different and maybe how they could impact your sales?
Yeah, sure. So the root cause and the technical problems are the same things, and that's what your product or service can actually fix or solve. So I'll give you just an example, I guess, from my industry, because that's what I'm at least most familiar with. Or what industry are you in? We could try.
I'm actually in B2C right now,
Okay.
with a different company, because they're actually really into pouring into their sales reps and developing them and training them. So that was the thing that caught my eye. But I'm trying to see, because my previous sales gig was B2B. So I was
Okay.
in a digital marketing space B2B, but I'm also trying to find like how to apply this in a B2C setting And I think you kind of touched on it a little bit there, even though you were talking about maybe the role of the business person that you're talking to, because they're in the network marketing niche. So they're learning from us how to build their network marketing businesses online through organic content creation and also in terms of like automation and duplication to scale. So it's part businessy, but it's not 100% just because they're kind of new to entrepreneurship and new to being business owners. And it's harder to pin down their numbers sometimes because they all have like different commission structures and different
Yep.
payouts and all that. So it's a little too much there to go in deep sometimes with some folks. But
Well,
I
yeah, but I
am,
can, I mean, I can talk a little bit about the B2C
yeah, that would be
direct
amazing.
sales world, right? So
Yeah.
I live in Salt Lake City. There's a lot of direct sales companies here.
Yep.
So, you know, let's so you're a seller for like I've done a lot of work with Young Living essential oils, so I'll just use them.
Yep.
So you're a seller for Young Living, and you're going to a party, and at that party, what you're hoping to do is talk to, you know, at least one or two people about getting a starter pack and signing up and joining your downline, right? Like that's your goal. So that the thing that you can do is provide them with a starter kit. That's really it, right? Like that's like the technical problem that you can solve, is that you can get them access to, you know, to the Young Living as a Young Living seller. But you don't know why that somebody would want to do that. And so I talked to one person who worked for a direct sales company, and they said our competition right now is the side hustle. It's no longer like, you know, traditional business or like other ways of making money. It's Uber, you know,
Mm,
it's Lyft, Airbnb, like all these ways to like get side hustles. And
wow.
so that's who we're competing with. So understanding that and creating out a pick list. So it's like, you know, the problem is that the technical problem is, what we'll go with, I'm kind of thinking on the fly here. Uh, they are, they are needing, they need access to a business plan that, you know, costs less than $500 or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and there might be some parameters around that, like because maybe they couldn't do like Lyft driving because they have, you know, 5 kids or whatever it is, so they can't be away from their home. So and those would go into impacts and business problems. Sorry, I've never actually built a pick list for direct sales companies, so
Mhm.
I'm processing here. So then the problem is the business problem is that they need to do that with without leaving their home, right? So they need to make an extra $500 a month or $250 a month without leaving their home. And if they don't do it, then that means that their significant other has to go get a second job. You know, then you start going through the impacts, right? The impacts
Mhm.
are significant other has to get a second job, uh, won't be able to see the kids as much, um, is going to be unhappy in our marriage because or our relationship because you don't see that person enough. You know, you can kind of go down those impacts. So
Mhm.
you can't fix that person's marriage. You can't fix the fact that their significant other wants to get a second job. Like you can't fix any of the impacts. You can't fix any of the business problems. But what you can do is give them an avenue. You can sell them a kit that affords them the ability to have a business that they can go and solve that in, right? So creating that pick chart and understanding what it is that you're trying to do. Now, that's not always what you're trying to do when you go to these parties. Sometimes what you're trying to do is just have fun with your family and friends and hope that they buy a few things of lavender. And so
Mhm.
then it's like, well, what does lavender do? It helps you sleep. What happens if you can sleep better? Then, you know, um, that would be future state actually. So anyway,
Well, yeah, because
I'm
what I'm trying to do is we're working with like just to give a little more context around it. And what I like that you said there is it's you can see how it impacts that person in their business if they're an employee for that company You just talked about the impacts of that person. Say she's a stay-at-home mom and her husband would maybe have to potentially get a second job and she can't really leave the home for her to bring some income in. Because like we're working with, network marketers that they could be with any company, but they don't know how to do it online. And they're also faced with a lot of rejection, which would be, now that I'm thinking about it, another impact, because there's an old traditional style of doing it, which is like knee to knee, face to face, one to one, events and parties at people's houses. That whole landscape has changed for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right, as far as like the pandemic and all of that, doing things in person. So we're giving them the opportunity to build through social media, so they can build out like their personal brand, their message, figure out their target market, and then start, once they build that presence up, get people onto their calendars so they can enroll them. And then, like I said, scaling would be later. But that's who we're dealing with, is they aren't necessarily business owners quite yet. Some every now and then have been in the game for a while and they've established themselves, but that's what I'm trying to figure out as far as the B2C. What is their business problem? I can look at that and I can define those numbers. But I was wondering if, like, because I've been starting to zero in on what you're talking about with my questioning, which is how is that impacting them?
Yeah.
And that's still a way of doing what we're talking about as far as gap selling. However, it's just a slightly different way of doing it because it's B2C. Is
Yeah,
that
and
correct, or am I off
even
there?
as I was like freestyling that whole like fictional situation in my head,
Yeah.
I realized that I made a mistake as I'm kind of replaying it that a lot of people make, which is like they go to the future state and impacts rather than hanging out in what is the current impact, like what is currently your current state, what is being impacted right now today on the pick chart when you're looking at current state.
Okay.
And too many salespeople do exactly what I just did, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
which is go to the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where we want to live. That's our happy place and all that kind of stuff. But staying in that current state. So, rather than my husband or my wife might have to go get a second job, it's we are uh, we are 2 months behind on medical bills.
Mm.
That would be an impact of not making that money currently. And so anyway, that would be a better impact rather than the future state. But yeah, I mean, helping. So you are anyway. I don't want to I don't want to get too much into the weeds there because I think we're kind of running out of time. But
Mm-hmm.
um, the idea of a pick chart is so that you don't get lost on a call. Like, had I actually created a pick chart and
Mm-hmm.
spent some time working through it prior to talking about direct sales, then I wouldn't have gotten lost in the woods. Because if I just try to make a call right now without anything,
Mm-hmm.
just called somebody to try to sell them on, becoming a Young Living distributor or whatever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
I would be all over the place. My questions would suck. I'd be kind of lost. So having at least a little bit of structure is really critical. And I think that's where the people that you trust who are close to you, your current customers, that's where that information can really help, is building out a plan and trying to ask questions to understand, do these technical root cause problems exist? And if so, are they creating these business problems? And if so, are these kinds of impacts there? If that's all true, then there's no closing, dude. Like it's you already will know that it's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
that you suck at your job. It just means that either A, you miss something, or B, you don't win 100% of the stuff. The idea of gap selling versus other sales methodologies isn't that gap selling, you're going to close 100% of your deals and everything else, you're going to close zero.
Mm-hmm.
It's an incremental change in probability of closing, but when you can increase the quality of your calls, when you can increase your probability of closing, that can have really big compounding impacts on most sales processes.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to get that pretty clear also. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean if you're like, I read gap selling and that book sucks, but I'm making $1 million, so you can all suck it. Like, I'm sure you are.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
Okay.
Good for you.
So we dug in a little discovery. We talked a little bit of role play. It's crazy how fast the time went. It blew by. But if you have a couple more minutes, we could dive into a couple topics and then wrap the show up, because we did go pretty deep, especially technically. But I'd love to talk just a little bit about that piece there, which you said, like the deal, if you've really, got into these objective truths, right, and really defined the gap, then it's, it's pretty much a done deal. Doesn't come with like some hard or high pressure type of close. So like, how do you view a couple things here? I'd love to look at like that closing process where it seems a little more fluid and kind of natural because of what you've looked in together. But then also, how do you, from maybe a gap selling perspective, think about or view handling objections? And then also, just if we could touch before we wrap up today a little bit on the presentation, or what pitching is, or how Josh Braun describes it, ditch the pitch. Because in gap selling, I remember reading about customization. So there's three things there, like whatever order you want to go in, but we don't have to go crazy.
I think they're actually all tethered to a common principle, honestly.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, just so, and the common principle is like anchoring or tethering. So if you think about like a boat anchor, where it's like you're going through the seas and you find an area you want to be in, that means that you've discovered the gap, like you're going to hang out in this place. And so you drop your anchor. And the idea then that you're constantly going back to the business problems and the impacts, right? Like that's where you're just living at when you are doing your demo, right? So you're going to custom create a demo that is going to show very clearly how your product or service solves technical problem, maybe 3, how it does these 3 or 4 things. Don't go any more than that. And that will solve business problem, 1 or maybe 2. And that if this is solved, and you're using their numbers and their words, not stuff that you make up, right? Again, it's objective truth. So if you are reading into it, if you are putting your own information into it, then whenever you go to do your demo or your pitch or whatever you want to call it, and they have not agreed that those numbers are correct, then you're going to end up in, some sort of traditional sales world, which is where you're trying to now convince them that the numbers that you came up with are actually true. But in a discovery process, you can create that scenario where they have given, you have talked through and ascertained the information together with them. And so that's what you are presenting to. So it's constantly anchoring back to the problems and impacts and the current state, and then their desired future state and outcomes, right? So because people can't effectively argue with their own information. And as long as you are not deceiving them, as long as you have not tricked them into anything, as long as you have created an open dialogue, then presenting to that information is going to greatly increase your amount of success, because they've already agreed prior to the presentation that A, they have a problem, B, they've quantified the impact with you, and C, if they don't do anything about it, there are problems in the future and they don't want those problems, or they're going to miss out on the gains in the future and they want to achieve those gains. They've already agreed to that with you. So I think most, at least in like, from what I've been able to tell in like the SaaS and tech world, discovery calls are short and with really long and complicated pitches. And I'm not saying that doesn't work, because I think that there's a lot of companies where that works for them. It's just that they're getting lucky. Honestly, they're just pitching and giving demos all the time, and sometimes they're hitting and sometimes they're not, which is not a really efficient use of a person's time. And some companies just, quite frankly, don't care. It's just like, just go out, get as much done as you can. I talked to one sales leader who said like, they don't believe in any processes, just go fast and break stuff. That's all they want to do. I'm like, okay, well, like no CRM, no process, no documentation, like just get out of the way, rev up the engine and set people loose. It's like, well, then you're not going to like any sales process at all. So going back to that idea, right? Like anchoring or tethering yourself to the objective information that you gathered is going to make things like overcoming objections. Because if they give you an objection, Keenan likes to use the phrase, I'm confused. And you say, I'm confused, you said. So if you get to the end and you're like, okay, this is going to cost, $15,000 a month. And they're like, that is way too much money. We cannot afford that, right? Like they say that. Like, oh, I'm confused because you said, and then you go back to your numbers and you just read it out. That this problem is costing you $125,000. Can you help me understand where I missed in how our product or service is, not is maybe not going to fix that? Because maybe you missed something, right? Or maybe they're just like, you know what, it's really not that big a deal, $100,000 a month, because you missed the impacts, right? Like you read into it that was a lot of money, but to their company, it's not a lot of money at all. So,
okay. So you mentioned also like the call process. What's your take on having a setter set the call and then somebody else actually goes through kind of diving into the discovery deeper, which is what I'm doing. And then we go into on that same call. So they've already kind of done a shorter version discovery, right, with the setter. Then we dive deeper. Then we get into presenting, like you said, 3 to 4 different things. And I'm trying to correlate or connect the dots based on what they told me to make it customized to them. It's a little more challenging because I'm not 100% customizing it, because I'm just gathering that information and then presenting it and tying connecting those dots, so to speak. But what's your maybe take on that, or thoughts around having a setter do that first introductory call and then doing all of that on the second call?
Yeah. So my take is I have no idea. I'm a big believer in principles, like closed-fisted principles versus open-handed methods. So for some companies, really dissecting and delineating their sales process down to where certain people do very specific tasks and then other people do it, and you break down the sales process, is going to be really successful for them. There are other companies where that's unnecessary. I've never worked for a company that had any kind of business development at all, in terms of like you have business development and then you have an SAE or anything like that. Like I've never had that before. The sales rep had to do 100% of it. So you did prospecting, you did discovery, you did the quote proposal, you did the presentation, and then if they signed up with your company, then you were their account manager. And so that's my background, and that worked for a lot of companies. Other companies, that's never ever going to work, and you've really got to break that process out. So I mean, I would say if you're going to do that, kind of the setter, kind of like bump, set, spike, if we're going to go volleyball terms, then make sure that your internal documentation is absolutely crystal clear, and that the handoffs are done in a way that is absolutely crystal clear. Because I've been part of buying processes where I've just inquired of people and I've gone through that, and having to repeat yourself every single time is really annoying. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So that would be the only thing that I would maybe say is a potential pitfall to it, but I totally understand why people do it, because it can take different skill sets to do different parts of the sales cycle.
No, I like that. So that repetition piece, because I kind of was like, I wonder if, because some of the questions are similar. So I try to actually navigate as much as I can around that to not do that exact thing, which is be too repetitive. But now talking about it, I'm going to actually look at it even more, because I kind of had that hunch, that feeling like I wouldn't want that either. So why do it?
Nobody likes it, right? Like sometimes I would go back to the doctors, but like there's one doctor's office where I'm like, where do you keep your doctor's information? Because I've been asked, what medicine are you allergic to? Like 50 times. And I'm like, why do I have to keep telling you guys this? Like, I want to change doctors because of it. How crazy is that?
Okay. So missed opportunity can even come from something such as repeating yourself. What you think is small could be huge. Okay. So what I'd love to do is wrap it up here, but man, this is amazing. This is another reason as to why I love gap selling. because it gets down to the nitty gritty, gets down to the specifics. And I think it's a valuable use of time. And just, talking with you, me being pretty new to the sales world, I've already learned a bunch on this call. And the same thing happened when I had Christian on from Keenan's team. I was just blown away because that book blew me away. But then when I listened to somebody who's doing this day in and day out, I'm just like, man, this approach, it fits so much better than what I've been exposed to. So one is I appreciate your time. Two is I'd love to figure out how folks can get in touch with you in regards to packaging or sales consulting, XYZ. How can they find you?
So I'm pretty easy to be found online. It's one of my bigger pet peeves about outbound salespeople is that they hide online. And I'm like, why? Why don't you want people to get in touch with you? Isn't that part of this whole thing? So I just adampeek.com, ADAMPEEK.com. And on there, you'll find my calendar link, my actual cell phone. It's not like one of the apps that you pay for, like it's my actual cell phone number. My links to my packaging podcast. I write articles on Medium. I did a TED talk on packaging. You can watch that there. If you're really curious and want to hear me preach, my latest sermon is up there also. Right. So yeah, just go to adampeek.com, or you can send me an email, which is what would be the best one, adam@pkg.consulting. So yeah, I mean, and I have various interests in life, and I try to never stop learning and never stop. I view people as inherently worth just my energy. It doesn't matter. Like, I do work with the poorest people in southern India. I've done genocide orphan counseling in Kigali, Rwanda, and I wrote and recorded a hip hop song. So whatever people want to connect up and talk about, I'm always down. But I'm really passionate about sustainability and packaging, saving the world, and helping salespeople understand how to get incrementally better in their sales too. So
right on. I love it. You mentioned education, so maybe one quick question.
Yeah.
3 books, your top 3 books. It could be business related, personal development, spirituality. It could be XYZ. But what would be 3 book recommendations before we end the show?
I mean, well, I'm going to leave out 2 that would be pretty obvious based on our conversation. So 1 would be the Bible, and 2 would be Gap Selling. Those are not equal in my mind, just so everyone knows, but they're both great books. Let's see, 3 books. I read a lot of books about a lot of different topics. So this is like legit a tough question. I'll go with The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, which is like a book of poetry from a Lebanese poet. That's a really powerful book that I've read multiple times. Let's see, another business book. I just read Cracking the Sales Management Code. And that was a really, really good book. I enjoyed that. It was hyper practical. And so that was a good business book. And then The Blockchain Revolution. If anyone's interested in learning about blockchain and crypto, they do a really nice job of creating normal communication out of what I think is chaos. Like, so I really enjoyed that.
All right. Beautiful. There you have
it.
Folks.
Are those 3 weird enough for you?
Those are great. No, I love it. They got bonus books, and then they got more books. So
yeah,
there's a lot of opportunity
I read like
to learn.
2 books a month, man. So that was a really tough question.
No, that's great, dude. I love reading too. I think it's a pretty important piece to becoming better humans and helping more people. Yep. All right. Well, appreciate your time, man. You've dropped many, many, many nuggets today. So I just want to thank you one last time. Thank you. Plus another extra thank you.
Man, thanks, Cody. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Alrighty, that's it, folks. Thanks again for tuning in. To get in touch with Adam, you can go to adampeek.com. He just mentioned that, but I just wanted to go ahead and share that one more time. The spelling is ADAMPEEK.com. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review. Hit the old like button, subscribe to the show, and share the show with everyone you know. If you'd like to go on the Vision Hunters journey with me, you can join me over on Instagram at the Vision Hunters Podcast or at Cody Allen Story, CODYALANSTOREY. And once again, welcome to the Vision Hunters Podcast. I really do hope you enjoy the shows. Until next time, folks, peace out.